Hello and welcome to Linus Napoleonic Shipyard. Today we are going to talk about the weather gauge because it's very important for the type of games that I think most of us play. I'm going to start with a quote. I'm going to read it here, and it's from the movie Master and Commander, and that's a movie that is loosely based on a series of books by Patrick O'Brian. Patrick O'Brian, he wrote, I think there's 22 books. 22 books. I've read them several times. Really recommend. It's a great fiction if you like the Age of Sail and Napoleonic era frigate warfare. But there's a quote from that movie, and it's just after the Surprise makes it away from the Acheron into the mist. And then the Aubrey, the captain of the ship, he gives the comment to Stephen Matrin, his good friend and the doctor aboard the ship. And he's saying, he may have had the weather gauge, but we had the weather gods. And that's Jack Aubrey that says that. And I think that is it's touching on something very important for a naval officer in the Age of Sail, and especially during the later Age of Sail when naval tactics had developed quite a bit. So Aubrey saying that is something, it mattered. The weather gauge mattered, especially for the British, as they've developed tactics around it, as I understand it. But I don't think it was a guarantee for victory, and that's what we're going to look into a little bit more with examples from history, and we're also going to do some stuff using Black Seas and also beat the quarters. Beat the quarters for the single ship action, and then Black Seas for squadron examples and so on. So I hope you would like to join me on this little journey, speaking about the weather gauge and looking into how we can use and how it's used in the games we play. And maybe some ideas I have of how maybe it could be used even further in play. I'm working on some really nice models that I got from a friend. I showed them in my last video, and those models are coming along. And of course I'm making a little bit of a photo album as I'm working on it. I'm going to be more in-depth with how I build the masts and everything. So that's probably going to be the next video with that entire build of those two frigates. So I'm doing a British frigate of the Lively class of frigates, started 1804 I think, and I'm doing the Pomone, which was a French frigate that the British captured. When she was captured, it was actually armed with 24-pounder guns. That was a little bit of an inspiration for the British, and it's also the inspiration, the hull shape and so on, is an inspiration for the Endymion class of frigates, which of most famous is of course HMS Endymion. They were inspired by this French frigate Pomone. There is more frigates named Pomone and so on, but this is the French frigate Pomone that was captured by the big British and then converted a little bit into more British standards and renamed HMS Pomone. But more about that later. So we're gonna jump right into the weather gauge and a little bit how it worked and in history, and then also historical examples when it was in use. And then we're gonna look at those examples, as I said, in Black Seas and B2 quarters. And I hope you can stand my face. I think I'm going to be using a green screen for this one. I'm not sure. I always think I stare too intensely into the camera and I smile too little. I'm actually pretty happy to do this stuff with you guys, and Let's start with the explanation of what the weather gauge is, or how I understand what the weather gauge is. So the weather gauge, sometimes it's spelled gauge, G-A-G-E, that means that you're holding the windward position. So you're upwind from your enemy, having the wind at your back when you look at your opponent. So you're holding the windward position. And on the surface, this sounds simple, but there is several tactical implications that makes it pretty, profound, I think. So the first of these things are initiative. The ship with the weather gauge can steer straight towards the enemy. The leeward ship, downwind, must tack back and forth into the wind to close. Tacking is slow, tiring for the crew, and limits your approach angles. The windward ship controls the range, can control the timing, can choose to attack or refuse battle by staying upwind. The second, and I don't know how big this is visibility. So especially when there's not that much wind, you're firing and then the smoke will blow towards your enemy. So maybe obscuring their line of sight but allowing you to keep yours. I've read that it probably is a little bit overstated in movies, this smoke, but it's there. Third, the heel. And I usually heel my ships a little bit. When I'm making the models for the game and so on, ships were heeling with the wind, right? And so you're going parallel, and you're in the windward position. Then there is several things happening. I mean, also for the leeward ships, things are happening. So the both ships would heel at roughly the same angle, given that they have the same amount of sail, but they'll be heeling so that the ship that is on the windward position, right, would have their ship tilted towards the opponent a little bit. And I mean, that's also plays into, I think Modeler Phil made some house rules where this is in effect for blacksmiths. So if which position you have, the leeward or the windward position. The British, they favored the windward position, not only for the tactical advantage, but also because they had a doctrine where they'd be firing on the down roll. So if you're firing on the down roll, then that's a good position because you're going to be aiming low, right? You want to hit the hull, the crew, and so on, spreading deadly splinters. The risk of that position is if there's a lot of wind, then I mean, maybe you wouldn't be able to open your lower gun ports because the gun ports would then maybe have a chance of actually being below water, so there would be water coming in through the gun ports, so you might have to close those. And thereby, if you have, like, say, 32 pounders, 24 pounders on your lower decks, you wouldn't be able to fire your heaviest guns. But there's definite advantages of having that windward position, and especially for British, firing on the down roll is important for them. And I guess it would be easier to aim low if you're on the windward position. The French Navy, I've read that they actually might have preferred the leeward position because they had this tactic of firing at the house and rig. This is not all prevailing, and a lot of this stuff, one place says one thing, another place says another. But if we go by that example, so the leeward ship would have probably an easier time firing on the up roll and aiming high, like for the rigging and so on. So if you would like to do that, being on that leeward position would be a good idea. And also, even if the wind is strong, you would probably be able to open your lower gun deck. So you'd be using your 32 pounders or maybe your 24 pounders, while the enemy might not be able to in the windward position. So that could be an advantage with the leeward position. So now we've looked into the whole thing with the heeling, right? So a ship heeling upwind or downwind, so to say. And so has advantages and disadvantages. Of course, I'm looking at it, I think the bigger advantage is, of course, being on the windward position. But the leeward ship could also disengage easily. You could just turn with the wind and then head off. And if you're the faster ship, the enemy would have a hard time catching up with you, right? So that's the option. You have the escape option, being the leeward ship. The windward ship would have to maybe beat into the wind, or maybe try to pass the bow or the stern of the enemy ship to get to that leeward position, and then be able to make its escape if it would want to. So what's the real answer? What's the best position, leeward or windward? I think the real answer here is it depends, right? Like with everything, really. It depends. It depends on the wind strength. In light airs, the heel effect is minimal, or maybe if you take off a little bit of your sail. And then the weather gauge might be decisive. In gales, you might lose your heavy guns or maybe then the lee is better. Also, in terms of your tactical goals, are you trying to sink the enemy, or are you maybe trying to escape, or you're protecting a convoy, firing on the rigging of the enemy, and so on. So it depends also on crew quality. Superior gunnery can overcome positional disadvantages. Also depends on the ship design. Some ships handle the weather better than others. And that's why studying real battles is very important, I think. Theories are pretty clean, but looking at examples from history, you find out it's seldom very clean. Let's look at some real battles from the Napoleonic Wars and then look a little bit into the tactics and how the weather gauge played in. So let's start at Trafalgar. Nelson held the weather gauge over the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. This wasn't just a positional advantage for him. I think it was strategic control. He had a specific mission in mind, right? The Franco-Spanish fleet didn't want to fight. They were trying to reach Cadiz. But with Nelson holding the weather gauge, they couldn't refuse battle. They couldn't outrun him, and they couldn't dictate the terms. So Nelson used his windward position to force a close action battle, which is what he wanted with those columns, right? Breaking the line. And the enemy wanted to avoid it. So the weather gauge gave him the initiative to attack when and how he chose to. Now the airs were pretty light, and maybe a little bit more air would have been advantageous for this tactic, because it was a long time when they were heading towards the enemy where they were actually taking a lot of fire. But it played a role, and it allowed Nelson to complete this tactic. So one example from history. Another, the glorious 1st of June, the 1st of June 1794. In the days before the battle, and the British fleet was led by Admiral Howe, and he did something there in the days up to it. He was maneuvering. They were maneuvering, trying to get a good position. So he wasn't looking for a perfect position to attack. He was fighting to gain the weather gauge. And I mean, there were days of sailing and tacking and positioning and so on. And I think it was all for that advantage of having the weather gauge. Once the weather was a little bit clearer and he had the weather gauge, he controlled the whole battle. He could choose when the battle was going to start. He could choose the range. The French couldn't really escape. And again, they couldn't refuse action. So holding the weather gauge in this situation, in this fleet battle, allowed the British to choose and dictate terms. The French did achieve their strategic goal to let the grain convoy that they were guarding escape into safety, but also Howe took 6 French ships and a 7th was sunk, if I don't remember it wrong. So both tactical and maybe strategic implications there. But it allowed Howe to control the engagement as far as the fleet battle was concerned. So, I mean, with this example, it works, right? Whoever holds the weather gauge can dictate the terms and win. But these are just 2 examples from history. There is plenty of examples where a ship would hold the weather gauge or a fleet would hold the weather gauge, but they would still not be completely successful. And another examples where a ship would give it up, as with the example, and I know I've run this many times, but we have USS Chesapeake and HMS Shannon during the War of 1812, where the Chesapeake held the weather gauge over the Shannon, and basically Captain Lawrence had every positional advantage, so he could have used this to maybe rake the Shannon from a position of safety, or he could have controlled the range or fought more on his terms. But Lawrence chose not to in this encounter. So instead he chose to engage in a straightforward broadside duel. Why? We don't really know. I mean, he didn't... I think maybe with those victories that the US ship had in this single, maybe he was overconfident, or some kind of chivalry was in play here, or maybe just a tactical misjudgment. Who knows? But as it was, he gave up that tactical advantage, and then the Shannon's crew, who had been relentlessly drilled by Broke in gunnery, used that superior gunnery and discipline to basically take Chesapeake out, and then finally winning the battle by boarding. So I mean, and the British even praised Lawrence after the battle for not exploiting his positional advantage. So there is something there. Would it have played out different? We don't know. But it shows something important, I think, because, I mean, the weather gauge is only important if you know how to use it, or if you decide to use it, right? When you don't, well, then it doesn't really play in. So the weather gauge had no effect on that battle, right? Because Lawrence chose to give it up. Another case is when a fleet is anchored, like in the Battle of the Nile, where the French fleet was anchored, and there was Admiral Breyer, I think, in Aboukir Bay, right? And he anchored his fleet on springs, on the cables, to be able to adjust their position. And this made the weather gauge more or less irrelevant, I think, because you're fighting a stationary target, right, that can turn regardless of the wind. So Nelson did have the wind. He attacked at dusk with the wind behind him, but what changed the battle was the envelopment, right? He chose to split, so he was attacking the French line on the inside and also on the outside. So he was attacking the French on two sides. But the wind did not really play that a big role, I think, in that battle. Of course, he had the wind behind him, but the French fleet being anchored, it didn't play into it that much, I think. So let's do another one, and this is on the Lake Erie, 10th of December 1813, and we're in the War of 1812 again. So at Lake Erie, the British squadron started with a weather gauge. So in theory, they would have controlled that engagement. But the wind shifted. The thing is that it was light airs on that day, and the winds were variable. And this can happen in reality, right? You can't really trust the wind. So by the time Perry transferred his flag from the Battle of Lawrence to the fresh Niagara and made his decisive attack, the weather gauge had become almost meaningless. So the airs, the wind, I mean, there's the weather gods, like Aubrey talked about in the beginning in the movie, right? That also plays in. So what mattered on that day was Perry's aggressive decision making, his willingness to sail Niagara directly into close action and break the British line, thus winning the battle. So in light winds, position matters less than maybe courage, boldness, I don't know what you would call it. So we've seen examples where the weather gauge was decisive and examples where it wasn't. So what made the difference in this, like, except for the weather gauge or with the weather gauge? I mean, a faster, more weatherly ship could probably overcome a positional disadvantage through superior sailing. If your opponent can outsail you, the weather gauge becomes a temporary advantage at best, because the opponent can then turn it on you. Second, crew training. Shannon's gunnery drill beat Chesapeake's positional advantage. British crews drilled relentlessly in gunnery, often overcoming theoretical disadvantages with practical superiority. Of course, the Americans were also really drilled, but maybe not Laura's crew at encounters as much. Strong winds made the weather gauge powerful. You had real speed and maneuverability advantages, but in light airs, positions mattered much less, as we saw at Lake Erie. Tactical circumstance, of course, also played in. Against an anchored fleet, the weather gauge is almost meaningless. In extreme close action, traditional position also becomes a little bit irrelevant, right? And then probably another thing that would play in is the commander's ability, or maybe also his willingness or his aggression. Maybe a bold captain with the lee gauge could achieve more than a timid one with the weather gauge, I think. Tactical initiative mattered more than positional advantage. So that's also playing into it. Strategic goals, of course, also play in. Are you trying to escape, protect the convoy, force a decisive battle? Your strategic objective determines whether the weather gauge is critical or secondary. So there's a lot of things that we have to play into this. So, but the weather gauge was a real advantage, but it was also a tool, and of course not a guarantee. So we're going to move into a couple of things where I demonstrate this using this 1 to 700 scale ships that we usually play with. And I'm going to be doing some examples with the Black Seas rule set, and then I'm going to do some examples where we're using more single ship actions, and we look at beat to quarters. There's some small differences in how the weather gauge works, or there's actually big differences in how the weather gauge works in these two games. But I think, especially in Black Seas, it is very decisive, because the turn order is Black Seas is basically the windward ship has the weather gauge. The windward ship also moves first. It moves and fires first, which is very decisive. So in Black Seas, it's everything, the weather gauge, because it allows you the initiative, right? Like it was quite a bit in history as well. And of course, you cannot trust it fully either in Black Seas, because you roll for the wind each turn. So you might have the best laid out plan, like I'm going to show in the example, and then the wind turns, and all of a sudden your plan just changes, because the order of play also changes with the wind. So the wind may be turning with the clockwise, right? And then all of a sudden the wind is blowing from a different angle, and then maybe some of the opponent's ships will end up having their turn before. This have happened to us over and over again when we're playing our battles. So a couple of those examples, we're going to look through them, and I'll probably be recording that live as I move the ships around the board. So it's going to be a little bit less scripted than this section. So we're moving on to examples. So here I have the British fleet and the French fleet, and the example we're using is first Black Seas. And in Black Seas, the weather gauge is really everything, because it really dictates who moves first and at what pace they can move. So as we can be seen here, this is actually a gauge from B2 quarters, not Black Seas, but we're using it sometimes and translating it into those points of sail for Black Seas. It's easier to measure with this one, because you just put this where the ship is and then point this from the direction of the wind, and then you find out how they're doing. So this ship here, the front ship in the British line, that's HMS Foudroyant, is sailing with quarter reaching or quarter running, so it's running really well before the wind. And the French line, as they are right now, are beating into the wind. And this is the only way for them to really get closer to the British line, is by doing that. But I'll get to that. So you see here, this is the wind, and this is the compass that you would be using in Black Seas. It has 8 points. So you have the south, west, north, east, and then of course southwest, northwest, northeast, and southeast. So 8 points on the compass. And that becomes important if the wind changes. I'm going to show you later example with that. But first this example. So in this case, the British fleet, and they're sailing in lines here. That's what you usually do when you're in squad in this game. Means that the front ship is the ship that decides what the whole line does, unless you break up the line. But we're not going to do that now. So whatever this ship does, the rest does. And they do it before these guys. And we're moving, so we're looking, the wind is coming from the north, blowing towards the south, and we usually do the part of the ship, the fore of the ship. So this ship's fore is before the French ship's fore here, the lead ships. So that means the British line are going to do all their movement before the French. Of course, the French could fire as they bear, but that can only be done after the British has finished their complete move. So if the British ships are still in line then, and the French would like to do it, they can fire. There's some disadvantages with that. Also, sailing like this, so you have, if you're running before the wind, you're maximally allowed battle sails. So if you're quarter reach, quarter running, then you're allowed full sails. And then when you go up to 45 degrees from the wind, then you're going to be starting to beat, and in Black Seas rules, and only allowed light sails. And that depends, this is actually your amount of movement. So on full sails I have 3 moves, on battle sails 2 moves, and light sails 1 move, and each move comes with a turn as well. So I could move, turn, move, turn, move, turn if I'm on full sails. Of course, firing on full sails has its disadvantages, so that's always a tactical decision that you would like to make. And turns in the game are decided by the turning angle, and the third rate, and all these are third rates, do have the larger 45 degree turn angle. So after each movement I could turn 45 degrees here. Also, a third rate ship of the line in the basic rules have a movement of 4 inches. So that's quite a good movement, because if I'm then going full sails I'd be moving 12 inches altogether, right? 3 times 4, which gives me a lot of tactical options in this situation. Of course, you can't move from light sails to full sails. You have to go turn by turn from light to battle to full if you had light sails previously. We say that last turn they were going with battle sails, and these guys were going with light sails. They were trying to beat into the wind. So they could technically, of course this position doesn't allow, but if they were sailing downwind, then they would be allowed to go to battle sails this turn. Now they're on light sails. So the British have moved into a really advantageous position. And what could you do then, according to the Black Seas route? Well, you start with the lead ship, and then all the others move after, and you can fire at any point during your movement. You could fire as she bears in one of your moves. Of course, there's disadvantages to that. So the best place to fire is after you've made a turn. So a move and a turn, then you fire. Then it doesn't give you any minuses. And you can do that at any point during your movement. And here the British, they want to be a little bit more cautious, let's say. So then they keep going on battle sails. So what can it do? Well, we have our movement here, 4 inches, 4 inches. And of course it's pretty safe to turn now into the wind, or with the wind, because this is not going to remove my possibility for full sails yet if I turn back up to a quarter running or quarter reaching. So that's one movement of 4, and maybe I didn't do a full turn, I do it like this, and then I go 4 here, and then I'm going to make a 45 degree turn. So this is a little bit more a cautious way, but I set myself up for a good position. Maybe that happens in this game. I didn't count it properly. Coronades have a range of 8, so this would be outside of coronade range, but it would be inside of 10, meaning that I could probably get a pretty good, if this is my initial broadside, pretty good initial broadside going here. That's a cautious route. Of course, here my whole line would be moving up and probably firing on the French ships as well. When it's the French turn, they could be moving 4 and then turn. Of course, that would allow them to, of course, give contra fire on my lead ship. So maybe not the best tactic, but it's a tactic. So this is usually how they played out, right? They were, especially in the earlier ages, they were sailing along each other, firing. But the windward fleet has the options here, and especially in Black Seas. Of course, I could be much more decisive. If I had battle sails, I declare full sails. So now I have 3 of those movements, and I'm going to be going 4 here in this direction now. First 4 here, and then I'm going to be using my full turn here. And we're turning from the front in this in Black Seas as well. Usually the original rule is turning from the stern, but we turn them from the front. That's from beat to quarter. So that's 2 movements, and I'm going to do another turn here a little bit to get in angle, and then we go another one here. Now I'm breaking the line ahead of this ratio. Well, actually I am not really breaking it yet, am I? But I'm much closer. So now I have the disadvantage of firing with full sails, which gives me a minus, but of course now I'm within 8, so now my coronades could speak as well. And so that would make a difference. And of course the whole fleet would follow, so I would end up with a line going this way behind the lead ship, and maybe that would be a more effective broadside. Of course you could go like we saw in Trafalgar example, we could go trying to break the French lines completely. Of course then we're risking it a bit with our lead ship, but our lead ship is pretty strong here. So again, I'm turning my 45 degrees. I'm not very careful here, and then we go another move, and then maybe I have to be careful now a little bit, but as you can see I still have the wind in my back here, so what would happen next turn would be that I would be going down to battle sails. So that was my second, was that my first movement, first turn, right? So now we go second movement here, there, and you can see already that I could be starting to break towards the French line here. Maybe not decisive yet, but I have the advantage to choose what I do. Of course I could also, with the wind, wear around. Wearing doesn't take any tests or anything, right? You're just turning with the wind, so I could be wearing around and then trying to get my line to engage part of the French line. So that could also be something I did with all these advantages that I have here in this situation. So here the line would be, and we are pretty lenient with how we move it. Like we move them like they would probably be moving, you know, we're not too picky with how we move the ship, as long as everyone is in on it. So this is maybe how it would be more like this direction. So this is the British line turning into the French. Of course now the French would probably have a possibility of raking the fore here, but also there could be a collision, so maybe not the smartest decision either. But I'm just showing the options that the British player has in this situation, having the weather gauge and the ability to do more movement. So the wind, your point of sail towards the wind, gives you the amount of activations, right? But also having the wind, being closest to the wind in the windward position, is also giving you the initiative. So you're moving first, and if it's 2 lines like this, your entire line is moving before the enemy's line. So it allows you a lot of options to do. I hope this brought it a little bit clear to you, some of the things that could be done in a fleet engagement using Black Seas rule set, but also the differences and the advantages of having the wind. Of course I could just haul off and fight them at a distance. The whole thing here is that I decide what's going to happen. The French, they're going to have to play a little bit to my tune in this situation. Of course they, unless they like decide to come off the wind and try to get it at the stern and maybe reposition and try to fight from another angle, which has happened in our battles. But it's a difficult situation having the enemy bear down on you. You could do things, and of course you do a lot of mistakes playing like this like next turn there would be battle sails, and there might be a lot of damage on this 4 ship here, since this whole line would be moving up. Of course, all these guys would have been opening fire here on the ships further back in the French line. Okay, I think that's good for the first example. We're going to look at another example using Black Sea's rule set. So now we're down to a smaller scale of ship and also smaller scale of engagement, still using the Black Sea's rule set. And so here we have a pair of brigs. It's a British Krung brig and a French brig, and wind situation is the same. They're pretty close to each other. I chose to have the situation pretty close as we start. Black Seas, I think it lends itself better to the larger scale engagements with many ships. And as you move to the smaller scales, at least if you're playing the original rule set, I find the SP is a little low on the small ship compared to the guns and so on. We tried to correct that. I actually released, and you can find that here on the channel. If you look in the videos, there's the latest set of house rules, where I've based the stats off a gentleman called James Dix. He had the idea, but then I've run with it, and so the stats are kind of based on the historical gun numbers a little bit more. There's more different types of guns and so on. I think it doesn't bog down the game at all, actually. You just need more different types of dice. But it also allows these smaller ships to have a little bit more variation. So they're a little bit more varied. So it makes the smaller scale a little bit more fun playing Black Seas. I mean, I do enjoy playing also smaller scale engagements using Black Seas rule set. The biggest advantage, and I'm going to mention that later as well, is probably the ease of play. So this is pretty streamlined, so it goes pretty quick to play. Okay, so in this example, the French ship, the French brig, has the weather gauge. Simply because it's closer to the wind, right? If we had more ships in the game, and I'm going to just bring in one shortly as an example, so let's put in another British brig. So now the French is in a little bit of trouble here, and so there's another British brig, and it's pretty simple to calculate it, because we're looking at the wind. Wind is coming straight from the north to the south here, and whichever 4 is hit first is going to move first. So 1, 2, 3 in activation. If the situation was like this, so like this, the way we run the rules, the French would have the activation. Of course, the stern of the British ship is closer to wind, but since we're going with the bow, the French bow is closer to the wind than the British bow. So then the French would move before the British ship, and that would be very nice for it in a situation like that. But we take that way. But that's how it works. So if you have different ships that are not in line, you count from the windward position towards the leeward. And of course that's a huge advantage, because again, whoever is closest to wind moves first. And here in this smaller situation, the French player again has all the options. He, in this point of sail that he has compared to the wind, he's more or less reaching, but that's also within the 45 degrees allowed by the Black Sea's rule set, so that means that he would be allowed to go full sails here. So going full sails, he could probably in this shorter situation, and of course the brig has a movement of 5, so it becomes even more decisive what he can do. So turning here, that's 1 movement, so that's 5, that's 2 movements, right? So it's showing you how flexible the situation is, and how well. And this is a pretty good tactic. Of course, you could be in this case setting yourself up for a stern rake, moving around. We have a rule, I'm not sure it's in the original rules, I forget nowadays, but we have a rule in those quick reference sheets that are mostly done by Model FL, where you have the option to heave to. so you're letting go a little bit of your sail, like putting some reefs in the sail, and then you move a d3 slower from that point on. So maybe you move 5, then you roll a 2, so then you move 3, even if you're going full sail. That might allow you to set up in a better position. But again, with that advantage, I mean, this one is going for the, even if he wants to do a reactive fire, he can't at this point. So the French is going to be able to give him a full broadside at this point, and this within coronate range. It's not close range yet. Of course, maybe with some more clever maneuvering I could get there. So weather gauge everything in Black Seas. Of course, say the French player has done his movement and he decides to be a little more careful his backing, and so he's like probably going, he's backing his roll f3, so he's moving 2 inches, so 2, turning 2, and then moving another 2, and then turning up, so he's here, and okay, gives a good broadside. The British turn, he's beating into the wind, so his only option is moving 5. Of course, he could also be heaving 2, putting reefs in his sails, but at this point he doesn't. So here he's going to be able to return fire. And this is mistakes that you do. So the French, he got the first fire, maybe it wasn't too good, wasn't too close to this broadside, is within 3. So that means that there's some of those advantages for being closer. So it is not everything to have, even in this game, it's not everything to have the weather gauge. It's a lot. Well, it's almost everything, because you do get the advantage, you get to move first, and if you also have the wind, then of course you can decide. However, say that the French player, okay, he has the wind, but he's done a big mistake, so he's in irons, okay? So even if he has the initiative, he's going to move first, the way Black Seas works. Of course, he is out of options at this point. He's going to be drifting and then turning and trying to turn off the wind, probably in this direction, since he came from that direction. So it's going to be turning off the wind and ending up somewhere here. So and he's not really in control. So doing a big mistake like that, of course, being in irons, then you could lose your advantage. And of course, skill as well. You can have all the opportunities to fire, but if your crew is not good, they're not going to hit, right? So a lot of things play in here as well, the quality. And of course, if you're playing with the original rule, the British does hit really well. And this is a gun brig, so he needs to get within 8 and fire his 2 coronades, which is really heavy. So some examples of how it could work. I think most of you play these games, right? I do recommend, and I would love if you give the house rules a go. They're uploaded in the Black Seas Facebook group as well, and it's like an online app web page where you can just set up your fleet, and then you export the fleet, and then you can use the ships, and it includes the ship cost and so on. There is not all those upgrades and so on in there, as I said in the last video, so you might have to do it. Yeah, you can do whatever you like with it. I mean, I just made it for myself, and then I figured you guys would like it as well. So, but give it a go and give me feedback, because I'm trying to get it better, make it better. I think it's a great addition to Black Seas. Makes it a lot of fun to play, and there's over 400 historical ships to pick from on that page, so you can just build your fleet from historical ships with their stats based on the historical, somewhat based, translated from the historical stats. So I think that was that for Black Seas examples. So let's do some B2 quarters. So we're doing B2 quarters, and right now we have HMS Surprise facing off against a similar size, maybe 32 gun French frigate. And in B2 quarters, the wind has more points of sail. First of all, there's more points on the compass. There's 32 points on the compass. Right now, this is north, and the wind is blowing south-southwest. So And then to measure what point of sail you have this device, and I've shown this in other videos, but you just put it where the wind is, and then you point it towards the direction of the wind here, and you see that this ship HMS Surprise is quarter reaching, and so is the French ship actually at this point. They're both quarter reaching, allowing them their full move in centimeters here, or you also count it in millimeters. So, and for a 5th or 6th rate, and of course the wind plays also more role because there is more strength of the wind. So at this point we're sailing in moderate breeze, and then the strength here of the wind is 383 millimeters are the allowed movement of these two ships. So that you take in account as you're playing your move. Of course both ships are going to move at the same time, and I am then on paper planning my turn. And a 5th or a 6th rate also has a maximum of 8 points of turn on this turning gauge. So that's quite a turn, and it's allowed to do that split in 2 sections. Probably you'll be running, since they're so close, if at least we would be running this as phased action, which means that you split the turn into 5 segments. So you do certain things in each segment. You split your entire movement into all those segments. If you're making turns, then you split the movement into the remaining segments. It's all in the rules. The rules are out for free nowadays, so you can just, and that's in another video, you can find a link and everything. Just look for those rules and you can give it a go yourself. Also these are printable. This I made for the 2025 version of this game. It's a fantastic game for single ship actions. If you have more ships, we find it gets slower with more ships. I mean, it is really the single ship action game. What we would like to do, and I think where it would really shine, is if you are a captain for each ship. So maybe you have a small engagement, maybe you have 6 friends, 3 on each side, 3 ships on each side, then all the ships could be moving at the same time. A little messy, but could be a lot of fun doing it like that. Well, so no one has the real initiative here as far as who goes first, right? Because it's not turn-based like Black Seas. So even if in this case HMS Surprise is on the windward position and the French ship is on the leeward position, there is no advantage as going first, because you go at the same time. So you plan out on your paper what you're going to do. However, again, of course, the French ship, to be able to turn into the wind this way, needs to be beating for a full turn. So he needs to find the point of sail where he is beating into the wind. It's running, so he needs to be beating into the wind here on this. I'm so confused sometimes. So there we go. So how does he need to turn now? He needs to turn all the way up here. So this is his new point of sail for a turn, if he wants to be able to tack through the wind without becoming in irons. So that's his only option, and that is what I've talked about in the historical examples as well. That's a little bit iffy, right? It's difficult. You don't need to roll for it as you need to do in Black Seas, where you do attack, you need to roll for it. I forgot to say that earlier. But it makes it hard. But you see, we also, the game would allow you to measure this many times. We only measure once per turn, so a little bit hardcore mode. You measure at the beginning of turn, which allows for more mistakes, because if you miscalculate your turns and you turn too much, so if I'll turn a little bit more into the wind here, square rigged ship would not be stopped here, would be in irons, right? A fore and aft ship could sail closer to the wind, but this ship, a 5th rate or 6th rate, would be stopped, so he would be in irons at that point. So a little misjudgment could make a big mess for you. if you're turning into the wind. So less option for the French guy. Of course, he could come off the wind and go this way and try to find new situations to fight the British ship. And that happens a lot in our game. The positions turn and everything. Maybe he could maybe try to make a strong turn and try to come getting a rake on the British stern, and you don't know what the British ship is going to do. Maybe he's, of course, and I've talked to Barry, who wrote the rules about this. He has some other days about that, but of course turning here in place, no ships turns in place like this. So it becomes, of course, it's not perfect. It is a little bit of an abbreviation there, or not abbreviation, but a little bit, it's a game. It has rules, but of course you would be turning on a circle and so on. We're looking into that. He has his yardarm to yardarm that he's looking into that with. So, but there is the possibility of the ship just using, basically, since it's wearing, it could be using 8 points on the compass here or on this turn wheel and just swap direction. And the French player might not be counting that at all. He was like going up trying to beat into the wind, and this ship just turned and gonna end up, breaking his stern. So there's a lot of things that can happen in this game as well, and the wind again, and this is why I love these games, like both Black Seas and Victor Quarters, because the wind is so important, like I think it was in history, because it gives you the option. Of course, this ship, if they're sailing the same direction here, he would be again having to beat into the wind, and that would give him eventually a slower speed, right? So this ship would be faster, and so he could just hold off here. He would be like clawing into the wind, trying to get closer, and the ship could be holding off and continuously like firing into him as he's trying to get closer. So that gives that windward ship a lot of options, like I've talked about, for deciding on when and how the action is going to be closed. So did I miss anything here? I'm not sure. Again, B2 quarters, at least when you're starting out, I recommend just going with single ship actions. There is fleet rules, and they work a little different, and of course playing it like a single ship action but with many players would be awesome fun, and a lot of action, I'm sure. We haven't really gotten to that point yet because it's really hard to get everyone together nowadays, but I'm still hoping for it. But I hope this made it a little bit clearer of how the weather gauge works in these two of my favorite games. And as I said, there is other things playing into it, and I looked into other rule sets that work. They use this turning, surface, and so on. There is different ways to do this. I'm actually looking at making a sailing game myself, of course, an earlier age, much earlier age, but also looking into all these things, like how it works and how you could work with both the windward position but also your point of sail for the initiative, like who gets the initiative and so on. So let's I'm gonna go into a little bit more the differences, a little bit more scripted, and then let's close this one off. But I hope this showed you some of the differences in these two games, and also like some of the options that you have when you're playing. There is that rule, I want to mention that we haven't really used it, but for next time we play Black Seas, definitely going to use it. It's the latest one from Modular Field, where there is this heel being taken into consideration. So if you're on the leeward position, you're heeling that way, and of course then leaning the other way. So firing on the down roll, firing on the up roll, and that would play into the gameplay. I really recommend taking a look at his latest house rules sheets that are also on the Black Seas group on Facebook. So we compared how the two systems, or we have looked at some examples from the two systems, how it works. I talked a little bit about it, but so Black Seas, I think it's simpler, faster system. The weather gauge gives you action priority. You move first. You have the weather gauge, you move first. And it's clean. It's easy to do and works well for squadron actions or fleet actions. You don't need that granular detail. So that's the advantage of Black Seas. In B2 quarters is you are moving at the same time, and you're planning your whole action ahead of time by looking at the situation on the board, and then you just play it out simultaneously. Still, the weather gauge plays a big role. It is there, not decisive like both systems. It's not decisive. It gives an advantage. So the windward ship in B2 quarters, as we've seen in the examples, and also in history, has a lot of tactical advantages, options open to it that maybe the leeward ship doesn't have. So it might have to spend a turn beating to be able to perform a turn, to get another angle on the opponent, and so on. So there is some differences in how these two systems works. Both are fun, and I think both are well implemented. So for what they're simulating, they work really well. So what can you take away from this for your own wargaming? When do you fight for the weather gauge? I mean, in squadron actions, the weather gauge is critical because especially like in Black Seas, like I said, it gives you that activation advantage, and also it gives you the maneuverability in like B2 quarters. There is advantages in both games. If you're in a long-range gunnery duel, the weather gauge lets you control range and visibility, which is essential. I mean, sometimes we're using that smoke to block. And if you have an inferior crew and ship, the weather gauge can partly offset the disadvantages. It gives you the option to dictate terms, right? If you have the weather gauge, even if you have the smaller ship, you can dictate on how you fight. So if you're in a close action specialist, maybe boarding tactics, coronades, aggressive tactics, getting close quickly can also negate an opponent's positional advantage. That is, if you can get to him. So if you have those tactics, maybe you would like the weather gauge before you engage, right? And through tactics and ruses, you can try to gain the weather gauge, as we've done it several times when we were playing. And that's the most fun, but keeping it in mind, I think that's the whole thing. When you're playing, like, always remember the weather gauge. Of course, you can't avoid it in Black Seas, but it's fun to have it in your mind, right? So let's conclude this whole thing. The weather gauge was there, it mattered. Admirals would spend days maneuvering for it, so it really played a role. Captains risked their ships pursuing it, right? So it definitely played a role in the Age of Sail. But it was no, as we've seen, guarantee for victory. Other things mattered. Skill mattered, training mattered, tactics mattered, and sometimes sheer boldness mattered most of all. So that could win the day. The games we play, Black Seas, B2 quarters and others, they simulate it well. The weather gauge is an advantage in the rules, just as it was in history, but it's not an auto-win. It's a tool. And like any tool, it's only as good as the person wielding it. So that's the big lesson here. Learn to wield the weather gauge. Also, today is 24th of December, and that's when we celebrate Christmas here in Sweden. So even if you're now watching this in 2026 in summer, I'm gonna wish you a Merry Christmas, because right now, as I'm recording this, it's Christmas here in Sweden. And I'm gonna go up into the main house. I'm in the guest house right now, and we are gonna do like we have done a few times, a marathon of Lord of the Rings. And I'm really looking forward to that. And we're also gonna make hamburgers using wild boar meat. So it's going to be wild boar meat hamburgers and Lord of the Rings marathon. And then tomorrow I'm going to be spending that with my closest family.